The salt spray was a constant ghost, clinging to everything at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado. It tasted of grit and effort, the same flavor that coated the back of every trainee's throat. On the grinder, the great blacktop heart of basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, men were unmade and, if they were lucky, remade. Today, the unmaking was a spectator sport, and the target was Frank Nelson. "Look at this, gentlemen," barked Petty Officer Rourke, his voice a serrated edge against the morning calm. He circled Nelson, who stood at rigid attention, his gaze fixed on the distant outline of the Hotel del Coronado. Rourke's finger jabbed towards Nelson's arm. A living, breathing history lesson. A museum piece. A ripple of uneasy laughter passed through the ranks of BUD/S Class 345. They were all young, sculpted from raw ambition and testosterone, their skin clean canvases. Nelson was the anomaly. He was older, his face a roadmap of lines etched by sun and time, and his arms were covered in the faded, blue-black ink of another era. "What's this one, Nelson?" Rourke sneered, tapping a blurry image of an anchor tangled with a sea serpent on Nelson's forearm. "Did you get that when ships were still made of wood? Did you serve with John Paul Jones?" More laughter, louder this time. Frank Nelson did not move. His eyes did not blink. He was a statue carved from granite and patience, absorbing the verbal blows as if they were nothing more than a mild breeze. His silence was a vacuum, and Rourke, a man who thrived on noise and reaction, hated it. It felt like defiance. "I asked you a question, trainee." "No excuse, Petty Officer Rourke." Nelson's voice was low and even, devoid of emotion. It was the standard, prescribed response, yet coming from him, it sounded less like submission and more like a simple statement of fact. Rourke's face tightened, a knot of frustration forming between his eyes. He couldn't break this man. For weeks, he had tried. Nelson was a special waiver candidate, a fact that Rourke found personally offensive. Someone in the Navy's bureaucratic labyrinth had pulled strings to get this old man a slot in the most grueling military training pipeline in the world. To Rourke, it was a mockery of the standards he was sworn to uphold. Whispers had followed Nelson from day one. He was some washed-up master-at-arms looking for a glorious end to a mediocre career. He was a desk jockey from the Pentagon who'd lost a bet. The most prevalent theory was that he was having a midlife crisis, a pathetic attempt to reclaim a youth that was decades gone. His tattoos only fueled the mockery. They weren't the sharp, intricate designs favored by modern operators. They were crude, simple, and faded, looking like something a drunken sailor would get in a port of call that no longer existed. The trainees, desperate to fit in and divert the instructor's negative attention from themselves, adopted Rourke's contempt. They called him Pops behind his back. The museum, they saw him as a weak link, a liability whose inevitable failure would bring punishment down on them all. They kept their distance, isolating him in a sea of youthful solidarity. "You think you belong here, museum?" Rourke leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "You think that old-timer ink makes you a hardman? It makes you a target. It tells me you're stuck in the past. Well, the past gets washed away here. The surf doesn't care about your stories." Rourke straightened up, his eyes scanning the class. "On your faces. We're going to help Mr. Nelson wash off some of that history." The collective groan was immediate but suppressed. The class dropped to the asphalt, their groans turning into the rhythmic count of push-ups. Frank Nelson was the last one down, his movements deliberate and precise, his form perfect. As his chest neared the scorching blacktop, his eyes remained fixed forward, seeing something beyond the pain, beyond the humiliation, beyond the shores of Coronado itself. He saw a different coastline, a different time. And he endured. The campaign against him was relentless. Petty Officer Rourke seemed to have made it his personal mission to see Nelson ring the bell, the brass bell that stood as a monument to failure, its chime signaling the end of another man's dream. Every day brought a new, inventive form of torment specifically designed for the older men. During log PT, the heaviest, most waterlogged telephone pole was always maneuvered onto Nelson's shoulder. The team of 6 men carrying the log would feel the crushing weight, their legs trembling, their lungs burning. Rourke would jog alongside, his face a mask of predatory glee. "What's the matter, Nelson? Is the log too heavy? Maybe you should have gotten a tattoo of a feather instead of that anchor. Pick it up. You're dragging the whole team down." The other trainees on his log team would shoot him venomous glares, their faces contorted with strain. They blamed him. The weight was immense, but Nelson never buckled. He would just set his jaw, his neck muscles cording, and drive his legs harder into the soft sand. He absorbed the weight just as he absorbed the insults, with a silence that was more unnerving than any cry of pain. In the pool, during drown-proofing exercises, Rourke's eyes were always on him. While others struggled, their movements frantic as they fought the panic of having their hands and feet bound, Nelson was a study in calm. He moved with an economy of motion that was hypnotic, using the water's buoyancy, bobbing to the surface for a breath with the methodical rhythm of a metronome. His placidity infuriated Rourke. "You think you're a fish, old man?" Rourke would shout from the edge of the pool, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. "Let's see how you do with a little extra weight." He would order another instructor to strap a 10-pound weight belt around Nelson's waist. It was a flagrant violation of safety protocols, a move designed to induce panic and force failure. The other trainees watched, their own discomfort forgotten, as Nelson sank to the bottom. A few held their breath, expecting to see a frantic struggle. But there was none. Nelson simply used a dolphin kick, a powerful, fluid motion from his core, to propel himself back to the surface. He took his breath and sank again. He repeated the process, over and over, his expression unchanging. He didn't just survive, he adapted, making the impossible look routine. The isolation tactics were the cruelest part. Rourke made Nelson the reason for every collective punishment. If a single boot in the barracks failed inspection, it was because Nelson's old eyes couldn't see the dust. The entire class would spend the next hour doing flutter kicks in the surf, the icy Pacific water stealing their breath. Thank trainee Nelson for this extra instruction. Rourke would scream over the roar of the waves. His attention to detail is clearly lacking. The resentment from his peers became a palpable thing. It followed him to the chow hall, where he often ate alone. It was present in the barracks, where conversations would cease the moment he entered. He was a pariah, a ghost haunting the edges of their tight-knit, suffering brotherhood. They saw his endurance not as a sign of strength, but as a stubborn refusal to accept the inevitable, a selfishness that prolonged their own misery. One evening, during the Purgatory of Hell week, the class was huddled in the surf, trying to fight off the creeping tendrils of hypothermia. They were 5 days in, and the world had been reduced to cold, sand, and pain. A young trainee named Miller, his teeth chattering uncontrollably, finally snapped. "Why don't you just quit, Pops?" he spat, his voice trembling with cold and exhaustion. "You're killing us. Just ring the damn bell so we can get some sleep." Frank Nelson turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting Miller's in the dim moonlight. There was no anger in his gaze, no malice. There was only a profound, weary sadness. He didn't say a word. He simply turned back to face the endless black ocean, a silent sentinel against the tide. His resilience wasn't an act of defiance against them. It was something else entirely, something they were too young and too tired to comprehend. This lack of a breaking point was what truly drove Rourke to the edge. He threw everything he had at Nelson. He pushed him until his body should have shattered, insulted him until his spirit should have crumbled. Yet, the old man just kept going. He never complained, never offered an excuse, never showed a flicker of weakness. Each perfect push-up, each flawlessly navigated obstacle, each quiet, enduring moment was a small, silent victory that chipped away at Rourke's authority. The instructor, who built his reputation on breaking men, couldn't even scratch the surface of this one. And he was beginning to suspect there was more to Frank Nelson than a midlife crisis and some ugly ink. The mystery was a splinter under his skin, and he was determined to dig it out, no matter the cost. In a quiet, climate-controlled office overlooking the grinder, Captain Thorne, commanding officer of the Naval Special Warfare Center, sat reviewing personnel files. Thorne was a man who believed in order and data. He had seen generations of warriors pass through these gates, and he knew that the seeds of greatness or failure were often hidden in the dry, black and white text of a service record. He picked up the next folder. Nelson, Frank. The name was unremarkable. He flipped it open, and his eyebrows immediately drew together. The file was unlike any he had ever seen for a BUD/S candidate. It was a sea of black redactions. Page after page was almost entirely obscured by thick, dark lines, the work of a security officer with a heavy hand. His service history, Previous units, awards, qualifications, all of it was gone, hidden beneath a veil of official secrecy. All that remained was the most basic information: name, age, 48, a number that made Thorne sit up straighter, and a single, cryptic line under the authorization section: assignment TO Bud/S Class 345 PER directive of CNO, the Chief of Naval Operations himself. Thorne leaned back in his leather chair, a low whistle escaping his lips. No trainee came to BUD/S by order of the highest-ranking officer in the Navy. It simply didn't happen. Not for a 48-year-old with a ghost for a service record. His curiosity piqued, Thorne began to observe trainee Nelson from a distance. He stood on the balcony of his office, binoculars in hand, and watched the classes on the grinder. He saw Rourke's relentless hounding of the older men. He saw the log PT, the extra push-ups, the obvious and unprofessional targeting. But more importantly, he saw Nelson's response. He saw the perfect, unwavering form. He saw the calm, methodical way Nelson paced himself on long runs, never flagging, his stride as steady in the 4th mile as it was in the 1st. He saw the preternatural calm during pool competency, a state of relaxation under duress that took most SEALs years to master, if they ever did. This was not a man struggling to keep up. This was a man holding back. It was the gait of a lion pretending to be a lamb, a performance so subtle that only a truly experienced eye could catch the truth beneath the deception. One afternoon, Thorne made it a point to be present for a uniform inspection. He walked the ranks with Rourke, his presence putting the instructor on his best behavior. As he stopped in front of Nelson, he didn't look at the uniform. His eyes went straight to the faded tattoos. He saw the anchor and the sea serpent. He saw a crude skull wearing a green beret. And then he saw it, on the inside of Nelson's right bicep, a small, crudely rendered trident. It was not the clean, official insignia of a modern Navy SEAL. It was rough, almost primitive, the kind of mark a man might give himself in the field with a needle and some gunpowder ink. Thorne had seen a symbol like it only once before, in a classified historical archive, in a photograph of the first frogmen operating in the Mekong Delta. That evening, Thorne returned to his office. He locked the door and sat down at his secure compartmented information facility terminal. He typed out a brief, coded message to a specific flag officer he knew at the Pentagon, a man who worked in the shadowy world of special projects and naval intelligence. His message was simple: query re, Nelson, Frank. Bud/S Class 345. Urgent clarification required. He attached Nelson's service number and a digital scan of the CNO's directive. He didn't expect a response for days, if at all. The wheels of the Pentagon ground slowly. But 20 minutes later, his terminal chimed. It was a single, encrypted file. There was no accompanying text. Thorne entered his credentials, then a series of passcodes. The file decrypted, and he began to read. For over an hour, Captain Thorne sat motionless, the only light in the room the glow of the monitor on his face. He read of nighttime parachute jumps into Laos and Cambodia. He read of riverine operations so deep in enemy territory that they were officially denied. He read of a small team of men, the precursors to the SEALs, who wrote the book on unconventional warfare with their own blood and courage. He read citations for valor that made the hair on his arms stand up. And he saw a name, repeated over and over again. Not Nelson, but a call sign, Odysseus. When he was finished, Thorne closed the file, which immediately erased itself from his system. He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the now empty grinder. The floodlights cast long, lonely shadows on the blacktop. He now understood. Frank Nelson wasn't a trainee trying to get into the SEAL teams. Frank Nelson was one of the men who had built them from the ground up. And he, Captain Thorne, had been letting a loudmouthed petty officer use him as a chew toy for weeks. A cold, hard anger settled in his stomach. This was not just an injustice. It was a sacrilege. And it was going to end. The setting for the final humiliation was not the grinder or the surf, but a sterile, air-conditioned classroom. It was a place for academics, a brief respite from the physical punishment. The trainees of Class 345 slouched in their chairs, their bodies aching, their minds numb with fatigue. They were halfway through a lecture on the history of naval special warfare, a dry presentation of dates and operational acronyms that did little to capture the reality of combat. Petty Officer Rourke was a guest lecturer, a role he relished. It gave him a different kind of stage, a new venue to exert his dominance. He prowled the front of the classroom, his pointer stick tapping against his thigh like a metronome of menace. He clicked to a new slide, a grainy, black and white photograph from the Vietnam era. It showed a group of frogmen, their faces smeared with camo paint, crouched in the dense jungle foliage next to a muddy river. These were the originals, Rourke said, his voice dripping with a reverence he clearly felt he was uniquely qualified to possess. UDT and SEAL Team 1 pioneers. Men who operated with nothing but a knife, a compass, and the guts God gave them. He scanned the room, his eyes inevitably landing on his favorite target. A cruel smile played on his lips. An idea, sharp and malicious, had just occurred to him. "Of course, we have our own pioneer in the room," he announced, his voice oozing sarcasm. A man who was probably there. "Isn't that right, Museum?" Every head in the room turned to Frank Nelson, who sat in the back row, his posture as straight and unyielding as ever. He said nothing. Rourke walked down the aisle until he was standing directly over Nelson's desk. "Come on, old-timer. Share some of your wisdom with these young bucks. You must have some stories from the good old days. Bet your tattoos have some stories, eh?" Nelson's eyes remained fixed on the projection screen at the front of the room. His silence only emboldened the instructor. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Rourke sneered. He strode back to the front and pointed his stick at the blurry image on the screen. "All right, smart guy. Tell us about this." Operation Crimson Tide. A UDT raid on a Viet Cong supply depot up the Mekong. A classic, but obscure, operation. Not something you'd find in the basic history books. Tell us what happened. Tell us what these men did. It was a trap. The operation was a footnote in a heavily classified after-action report. Rourke had only learned of it through a senior chief who had a passion for SEAL history. There was no way a random waiver candidate would know the details. He expected Nelson to stammer, to guess, to finally show a crack in his stoic facade. He would be exposed as a fraud, a wannabe who knew nothing of the legacy he pretended to represent. A heavy silence filled the classroom. The trainees watched, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity on their faces. This was it. The final, public breaking of the old man. Frank Nelson pushed his chair back. The sound of its legs scraping against the linoleum was unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked to the front of the classroom, his eyes never leaving the grainy photograph. The trainees leaned forward in their seats. Rourke crossed his arms, a triumphant smirk on his face. Nelson didn't stop at the lectern. He walked right up to the screen, his shadow falling across the projected image. He stood there for a long moment, his back to the class, studying the faces in the picture. The air grew thick with tension. What would you do in this recruit's boots? Comment below if you think this drill instructor is crossing the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. The flat, emotionless tone was gone. In its place was something else, something quiet and resonant, a voice that carried the weight of memory. "Operation Crimson Tide is the wrong name," he said softly. "That was the official designation for the paperwork. The men who were there, we called it the Serpent's Mouth." A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. "We." He had said we. Rourke's smirk faltered. Nelson raised a hand and pointed to a shadowy figure on the far left of the photo, a man barely visible behind a large palm frond. "That's Lieutenant Junior Grade Michael Thornton. We called him Thorny, he was the officer in charge. Scared of snakes, but he'd swim through a nest of them if a mission required it." His finger moved to another man, one whose face was half submerged in the river's murky water. "And that's Petty Officer Thomas Norris. Tommy, quietest man you'd ever meet." Until the shooting started. The classroom was utterly silent now. The trainees were no longer slouching. They were sitting bolt upright, their eyes wide, hanging on every word. This was not a history lesson. This was a testimony. The water wasn't just muddy, Nelson continued, his voice a low murmur, as if he were speaking only to himself. It was warm. Like bathwater. You could feel things brushing against your legs in the dark. We'd been in the water for 6 hours, moving less than a mile. The rebreathers we used back then. Dragers, they tasted like stale rubber and metal. Every breath was a chore. You had to fight for it. He paused, his finger tracing the outline of the riverbank on the screen. The intelligence was wrong. It wasn't a supply depot. It was a command and control bunker. Heavily fortified. 2 machine gun nests we didn't know about. They opened up on us the second Thorny's team hit the bank. His voice was a calm, steady narrative, but the words painted a picture of pure chaos. He described the green tracers cutting through the pitch-black night, the concussive whump of grenades, the screams of wounded men. He spoke with the chilling, detached clarity of someone who had been there, someone whose mind had seared every detail into permanent memory. Thorny was hit. Badly. A round went through his back and out his chest. Tommy and I were the cover team, still in the water. We saw him go down. Protocol was to break contact, evade and escape. But you don't leave a man behind. You never leave a man behind. He turned from the screen and faced the class for the first time. His eyes were clear and sharp, and for the first time, the trainees saw not an old man, but something ancient and formidable. So Tommy laid down suppressive fire while I swam to the bank. I got Thorny on my shoulders. He was dead weight. I could feel his blood running down my back, warm in the cool night air. I started swimming back across the river. It was over 300 meters of open water. The entire NVA garrison was shooting at us. I remember thinking how beautiful the tracers were, skipping across the black water like red fireflies. He stopped talking. The silence that followed was profound, absolute. It was the sound of 24 young men having their entire worldview shattered. They were looking at a ghost. A living, breathing piece of the very history they had been studying. Rourke stood frozen, his face ashen. The swagger was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed disbelief. The trap he had so carefully set had not caught Nelson. It had sprung on himself, revealing his own staggering ignorance and arrogance. At that precise moment, the door at the back of the classroom opened with a soft click. Captain Thorne stepped inside, followed by the Command Master Chief. They stood there, their presence a silent, powerful judgment. No one noticed them at first. All eyes were still locked on Frank Nelson. Captain Thorne walked slowly down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing in the tomb-like silence. He stopped beside Nelson and stood shoulder to shoulder with him, facing the stunned class. He didn't look at Nelson. He looked directly at Petty Officer Rourke. Petty Officer Rourke, Thorne's voice was unnaturally calm, yet it cut through the room like a shard of ice. An impressive history lesson. Though it appears to be incomplete. Rourke flinched as if struck. He finally found his voice, stammering, "Captain, sir, I was testing the trainees' knowledge." "Is that what you were doing?" Thorne asked, his voice dropping even lower. "Testing him? Or were you humiliating a man you have been relentlessly targeting for weeks?" The captain took a step forward, his gaze sweeping over the trainees before settling back on Rourke. "Let me complete the lesson for you. Let me tell you all what happens next in that story. Let me tell you about the men who swam over 300 meters under constant, direct enemy fire, holding his mortally wounded officer, and then dragged him for 2 kilometers through the jungle to a successful extraction." Thorne turned slightly and looked at Frank Nelson. For that action, the man in that photograph was awarded the Navy Cross. He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. The trainees stared, their minds struggling to process the information. "But that's not the most interesting part of the story, is it?" Thorne continued, his eyes boring into Rourke. "The most interesting part is what we can't see. What we can't see are the marks on that man's body. The tattoos you find so amusing, Petty Officer." Thorne raised his hand and pointed to the faded anchor on Nelson's forearm. "This one," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "This one he got in 1968, after a combat dive mission to recover a downed pilot from Haiphong Harbor. He and his swim buddy spent 72 hours in enemy water. They were both awarded the Navy Cross for that." He then pointed to the crude skull with the green beret. "This one is for his time with MACVSOG, running cross-border operations. It represents a mission so classified that most of the details are still blacked out. What isn't blacked out is the citation for his 3rd Navy Cross." The room was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. The trainees were pale, their faces a mixture of shock, shame, and a dawning, overwhelming awe. They were beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. And that little trident, Thorn's voice grew hard. The one that looks so crude compared to the shiny pin you are all so desperate to earn. That is the mark of a plank owner. He got that one in the jungle, with a bamboo needle and gunpowder, alongside the other founding members of SEAL Team 2. It represents his 4th Navy Cross, for the very action he just described to you. Thorn took another step toward Rourke, who seemed to shrink under the captain's gaze. You see, petty officer, you haven't been harassing a trainee. You've been abusing a living legend. This man's tattoos aren't a sign of nostalgia. They are a testament to a level of valor you can't even comprehend. Each one of those faded marks was paid for in blood and courage, in operations that defined what this program is all about. Thorn stopped directly in front of the instructor. You thought he was a museum. You were right. He is a museum. He's a walking, breathing monument to the ethos of naval special warfare. An ethos of quiet professionalism, of humility, of letting your actions speak louder than your words. An ethos you have clearly forgotten. Sir, I didn't know, Rourke whispered, his career flashing before his eyes. You didn't know because you didn't look, Thorn snapped. You saw an old man and you made an assumption. You let your ego and your prejudice cloud your judgment. You are an instructor. Your job is to build warriors, not to indulge your own insecurities by bullying your students. You are not fit to teach these men. You are not fit to wear that trident. The finality in the captain's voice was absolute. Command Master Chief, escort Petty Officer Rourke to his quarters. Have him pack his personal belongings. He has a flight to Diego Garcia at 0800. His new duties will involve supervising the loading and unloading of supply pallets. I'm sure he'll find it less taxing. The public condemnation was complete. Rourke, the arrogant gatekeeper, the tormentor, was broken. He stood, stripped of his authority and his pride, and allowed the Command Master Chief to lead him from the room without another word. His downfall was as swift and brutal as the training he so enjoyed inflicting on others. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving a void of stunned silence in his wake. With Rourke gone, a new reality began to settle over the classroom. The foundation of their world had been upended. The men they had scorned, the men they had mocked as pops, and the museum was not a liability. He was the standard. A standard so high they couldn't even see it. Captain Thorn turned his attention back to the class, his expression severe. Let this be a lesson to every single one of you. The most dangerous man in the room is often the quietest. The deadliest weapon is humility. You judge a man by the content of his character and the strength of his actions, not by his age or the ink on his skin. He then turned to Frank Nelson, and his entire demeanor softened. The hard edge in his voice vanished, replaced by a tone of profound and genuine respect. He didn't address him as trainee or Nelson. Master Chief, he said, the title landing with the force of a thunderclap in the silent room. I believe your assessment is complete. The trainees' jaws collectively dropped. Master Chief. A title of reverence in the Navy, reserved for the most senior and experienced enlisted leaders. It was a rank that commanded immediate, unconditional respect. Thorn addressed the bewildered class one last time. This is Master Chief Frank Nelson. He was never a BUD/S candidate. He volunteered to come here, at the personal request of the Chief of Naval Operations, to go through this pipeline one more time. His mission was to evaluate our training program from the inside. To see if the men we are producing still have the heart, the grit, and the character of the originals. To ensure that the spirit of the teams has not been diluted, he paused, letting them absorb the enormity of the revelation. He wasn't your peer. He was your assessor. And you have all been under his microscope since day 1. The shame in the room was a physical force. It pressed down on the trainees, flushing their faces with heat. They thought back on every joke, every insult, every glare of resentment they had directed at him. They had been tested, in a way they never anticipated, and they had failed spectacularly. That evening, the atmosphere in the barracks was subdued and somber. The usual boisterous energy was gone, replaced by quiet contemplation. Frank Nelson sat on his bunk, methodically cleaning a rifle, his movements as precise and unhurried as always. A shadow fell over him. He looked up to see Miller, the young trainee who had screamed at him to quit during Hell Week. The boy stood shifting his weight, his face a mask of misery. "Master Chief," Miller began, his voice barely a whisper. There's no excuse for how I acted. For how we all acted. I am so sorry." Nelson stopped his work. He looked at the young man, really looked at him, and saw not malice, but the fear and exhaustion of a boy being forged into a man. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "It's a hard road, son. It's supposed to be. But we disrespected you," Miller pressed, his eyes pleading for absolution. "We disrespected everything you represent." "The past is the past," Nelson said, his voice calm. "What matters is what you do now. What you do tomorrow. You learn. You get better. You never make the same mistake twice." He picked up his cleaning cloth and resumed his work, the conversation, for him, being over. The gesture was not a dismissal, but a lesson in itself. Dwell on the mission ahead, not the failures behind. 2 days later, the entire Naval Special Warfare Center was summoned for a base-wide assembly. The trainees from every phase of BUD/S, the instructors, and the support personnel all gathered in the vast auditorium. A sense of anticipation hung in the air. Captain Thorne walked onto the stage, followed by Frank Nelson. But this was not the trainee Nelson they knew. He was wearing the immaculate dress-white uniform of a Command Master Chief. On his chest was a breathtaking array of ribbons, a vibrant tapestry that told a story of decades of service and sacrifice. At the very top, nestled among other citations for valor, were 4 Navy crosses, each one a testament to the legends they now knew were true. He was no longer the outsider. He was the source. Captain Thorne stepped to the podium. "For the past several weeks," he began, his voice booming through the auditorium, "we have had a guest among us. A quiet professional who came here not to earn a place, but to remind us of what our place truly is." He gestured to Nelson. "Many of you, especially the students of Class 345, knew him only as a trainee. Today, I am formally introducing you to Command Master Chief Frank Nelson, a pioneer of naval special warfare and, for the remainder of your training cycle, your new guest instructor." A wave of murmurs and whispers swept through the hall, followed by a sudden, spontaneous eruption of applause. It started with Class 345, who jumped to their feet, and quickly spread until every person in the auditorium was standing, their ovation thunderous and heartfelt. It was a resounding apology and a welcome tribute all in one. Nelson stepped forward, acknowledging the applause with a simple, humble nod. The ovation slowly subsided, and an expectant hush fell over the crowd. He looked out at the sea of faces, young, eager, and hungry for knowledge. He saw himself in them, so many years ago. "The medals, the ribbons, they're just markers of a moment in time," Nelson said, his voice carrying to the furthest corners of the hall without the aid of a microphone. "They don't teach you how to control your breathing when you're out of air. They don't teach you how to read the fear in another man's eyes. And they don't teach you the most important lesson of all, that the man next to you is more important than you are." He looked directly at the trainees of Class 345. "The things that will keep you alive, the things that will make you a true brother of this community, cannot be found in a history book or pinned to a uniform. They are forged here," he said, tapping his temple, and here he tapped his chest. "In your mind, and in your heart. That is what I am here to teach you." The story ended there, but a new one was beginning. The legend of the museum spread like wildfire through the base, a cautionary tale about arrogance and a powerful lesson in humility. Master Chief Nelson became the most revered instructor at BUD/S, teaching not from a manual, but from the scars and memories of a life lived at the sharpest edge of conflict. He taught them what the medals could never convey, the silent, unbreakable spirit of a true warrior. And the young men of Class 345, now humbled and wiser, were the first to learn that the greatest strength is not in the noise you make, but in the quiet resolve you carry within.